Hello, everyone, and welcome to our poster presentation. We are Dr. Eugene Walls, Dr. Shanna Katari, and Leo Katari, and I am Dr. Brittany Ash. We are here today to share about next best practices in research on LGBTQ and transgender and non-binary folks and communities. Research on LGBTQ and transgender and non-binary people and communities has experienced methodological shifts over the last 5 decades. Prior to the 80s, scholarships was either non-existent or tended to be in segregated community journals that experienced academic marginalization, as did many scholars working on LGBTQ and TNB subjects, a trend that actually still exists today in some academic contexts. Work from this time period mostly focused on cisgender gay men and to a lesser degree cisgender lesbian women. The 90s did, however, see an explosion of research about the community, but with almost a singular focus on HIV and AIDS, with a primary focus on cisgender men who slept with men as well as trans women. In the 2000s, research began to look more broadly at the community, typically combining LGBTQ and TNB folks into one analytic category. Bisexual, queer, and transgender and non-binary folks were still largely absent from all research, and there was little attention paid to the axes of differences such as race and disability. Some of this methodological approach of using a singular analytic category was a product of reliance on small samples, and so they were putting folks together in order to get a large enough sample size because large national data sets rarely asked about sexual orientation or gender identity. Over the years, there have been numerous calls by scholars to recognize that sexual orientation and gender identity are totally different constructs, and that combining LGBTQ and TNB individuals into the same analytic category obscures and confounds differences, along with calls to include sexual orientation and gender identity on national surveys to ensure that bisexual, queer, and trans individuals are included, and for an increased compositional diversity in LGBTQ+ focused studies. More recently, a recognition within group differences and group diversity has argued for an increased response category and sampling approaches that include asexual, non-binary, genderqueer, and other identities. Many of these calls for methodological improvements now form the basis of best practices on LGBTQ and TNB research and has resulted in nuanced and intersectional understandings of the community. So where do we go from here? How do we continue to improve the quality of research with LGBTQ and TNB communities? In recent years, we have examined the intersection between sexual orientation and gender identity, and the findings bear out what we would expect, that there's differential risks across that intersection. And this is true for virtually every risk that we have examined. So this is a large table that attempts to summarize the findings from several studies that we have done. So we've examined school safety, depression and suicide, sexual risk, forced sex, partner violence, and sexual behavior, among some newer studies as well. So this is a lot to take in, but the overall story is that there are definitely differential outcomes based on the intersection of gender identity and sexual orientation, with those that have multiple marginalized identities tending to fare worse in those outcomes compared to both cisgender heterosexual folks and then also cisgender folks with minoritized sexual orientations. So, for example, if you look at the row that examines the intersectional identity of trans folks that are questioning their sexual orientation, and you go to the school safety column, so this column right here, you can see that trans folks that are questioning their sexual orientation are significantly less likely to feel safe at school and are more likely to be bullied at school and online. They're also more likely to skip school because of safety concerns compared to their cisgender heterosexual peers. Looking at one more example, you can move to the row that examines the intersectional identity of trans folks that are LGB. And if you go to the depression and suicide columns, you can see that transgender LGB folks had 6 times the odds of experiencing past 2-week depression, had 7 times the odds of having a plan related to suicide, and had 10 times the odds of a past suicide attempt. All outcomes compared to their cisgender heterosexual peers. We hope these outcomes provide evidence that it's time to stop lumping sexual orientation and gender identity when conducting research, and also that they provide evidence that it's important to think about research from an intersectional perspective that shouldn't just be limited also to this certain intersection of gender identity and sexual orientation, but others as well.
Now, shifting our attention to recommendations for best and next practices in research with LGBTQ and trans non-binary populations, we offer recommendations from our own experiences as well as from existing scholarship for both the data collection process as well as ideas on reporting and interpretations of findings. In terms of the data collection process, first make sure to ask questions about gender identity and sexual orientation separately rather than in a combined question, in order to avoid conflating the two. And of course, asking about both is ideal. In response sets for both gender identity and sexual orientation, ensure that you include emerging and contemporary identities. This would include identities, for example, such as pansexual and asexual for sexual orientation, and genderqueer and agender for gender identity. There are numerous other identities as well. While a comprehensive response set is important in research with these communities, it is particularly important in research that targets youth and young adults. Identities can also vary in terms of cultural differences, so inclusion of identities such as same-gender loving and two-spirit, which are more common in African American and American Indian populations respectively, is also important. Binaristic response sets that provide only two options and that ignore the fluidity and variation in sexual orientation and gender identity not only are invalidating to lived experiences, but also restrict the quality of the data collected. As such, they should be avoided. While earlier research with the transgender and non-binary community frequently asked questions about sex assigned at birth, as a researcher, one should consider whether this information is really needed. Many in the community find this question offensive and invalidating. If these data are necessary to the research project, we suggest that you should first ask gender identity prior to asking sex assigned at birth, and second, providing an explanation to respondents on why sex assigned at birth is important to the research project may both reduce reluctance to answer the question and decrease the harm done by the question. Because having a comprehensive response set is likely not plausible, allowing write-in responses to sexual orientation and gender identity is also recommended. However, rather than using the language "other, please specify" with the write-in option, using a phrase such as "identity not listed, please specify" may be experienced as less othering. We recognize that write-in responses are more costly to code and can result in responses that are occasionally not helpful. However, we argue that the additional burden for the researcher is offset by decreasing the invalidation that respondents experience. Allowing for multiple responses is also recommended for both sexual orientation and gender identity. Doing so again allows the respondent to more accurately reflect their lived experience rather than forcing their experience into one category. Recent methodological research by Saperstein and Westbrook suggests that a two-step categorical approach whereby sex assigned at birth and current gender are both asked produces more reliable data than asking a single question about gender identity. Doing so allows the research to distinguish between sex and gender, if that is critical in the research project, and allows for both direct and indirect identification. When the constructs of both sex and gender are important in the research, one difficulty can be that some languages do not have separate words for the two constructs. The final point in terms of data collection pertains to careful consideration of various aspects of sexuality and gender that may be important to collect. These include direct measures of gender expression, age of identification, social transition, sexual attraction, sexual behavior, first-order gender scale that captures how one sees oneself, and a third-order gender scale that captures how one thinks others see oneself. Having measures of these aspects can allow the researcher to tease out nuances of lived experiences that may influence the social phenomenon being explored. Turning our attention now to reporting and interpretation. While it may be necessary if one is using secondary data analysis, as much as possible, avoiding combining gender identity and sexual orientation into one analytic category moves the scholarship away from the conflation of the two. If one sample is large enough, reporting results for different sexual orientations rather than combining LGBTQ and other sexual orientations into one analytic category is also recommended. Failing to do so may obscure important differences. For the same reason, reporting results for different gender identities rather than a combined transgender, non-binary analytic category is also recommended. When category size necessitates combining sexual orientations or combining gender identities into a collapsed analytic category for inferential statistical analysis, providing the breakdown of categories in reporting the sample demographics is recommended. Additionally, statistically testing the manner in which categories are collapsed to ensure that differences do not exist between the categories is important for accuracy in results. And of course, when collapsing categories is necessitated by small sample sizes and supported by statistical testing, this combining of categories should be mentioned in the limitations section of the results. As we demonstrated earlier from our research findings, creating intersecting categories of gender identity and sexual orientation recognizes both the differences in the identities as well as the way in which the lived experiences of this intersection shapes risk and resilience. If the sample size permits, extending this intersectional approach to analysis to include other identities such as social class, race, or disability can move the scholarship forward in important ways. Back to our prior point about collected data regarding sex assigned at birth, if you have collected these data, again consider very carefully whether reporting this information is critical to your study. And if it is, think critically about how you are interpreting the meaning of this variable. Similarly, try to avoid using demographic variables as proxies if at all possible. For example, data regarding gender identity does not necessarily provide information about a respondent's gender expression. In situations where you must use one variable as a proxy, acknowledging that explicitly and including that information as a limitation is important. Finally, in your interpretation of demographic categories, rather than reifying demographic categories, interpret them more accurately as experiences of being gendered or sexualized. For a more in-depth discussion of this approach, we suggest reading Chapter 7 in Tukufu Zuberi and Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, White Logic, White Methods. Their discussion focuses on this approach with variables capturing race, but their cautions and logic are similarly applicable to variables capturing sexual orientation and gender identity. If you have any questions about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Our contact information is listed here. Thank you.